to call this work session of the Assembly to order. We're going to go over the amendments to the Chugach Access Plan, and I presume have some discussion with the planning department on their thoughts on them as they appear. If everyone's okay, I would like to start with the amendment analysis for 1 through 15 that Mr. Weaver has provided to us, I presume, or Mr. Tobish, one of you?
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's entirely possible that I won't move those.
Oh.
I'd like to have a broader discussion about some of the applications. In my methodology to taking some of the points out, it's clear that I probably won't be able to take them all out. So 1 through 15 was just sort of the start. If there's a legislative solution, another way to soften language is elsewhere. I've got a couple proposed amendments that Julie has worked on, but she's sort of been on again, off again with health. So I don't mind. I didn't want to debate the concept.
Actually, Ms. Ray Jackson made a very reasonable point. We're supposed to do introductions before we do this, and I forgot to do it. So if we could start, Mrs. Johnston.
Jennifer Johnston.
Bill Evans.
Amy DeBosky.
Bill Starr.
Elvie Green Jackson.
Pete Peterson.
Patrick Floyd.
Paul
And from the administration we have?
Tobish.
Jerry Weaver.
on the phone.
Welcome, Ernie.
I'm Monica Alvarez from DNR.
Thank you, Monica. And Mr. Wheeler or Mr. Michaelis, do you want to say hello to us?
Hello. George McKeon.
Dennis Wheeler, Municipal Attorney.
Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Jackson. I apologize for my oversight. Thank you, Mr. Starr. I appreciate your comment. Would it be helpful perhaps to start with the memorandum that Mr. Weaver's department prepared and to walk through that and to talk specifically to the administration?
Yes, other than where he's going with that, on that is somewhat helpful to have the full verbiage on it, and not everyone has their Title 21 book on it, so if I could have the liberty to read it, there's a paraphrase portion at the bottom, but there's quite a bit more significance above it inside of this that I'd like to make sure are clear to the body before we debate this portion.
Well, we're not debating today, as you know, but if you're okay, I would like to start with Mr. Weaver presenting what he's prepared for us.
Fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have the code here, Mr. Starr. We have actually the comp plan, the Chugach River comp plan, and the 2020 plan as well, if you want to see the specific wording of things. But, you know, basically to give you an update and understanding of how we got here to where we are today, revert goes back to the charter, basically in section 12 of the charter. Requires comprehensive planning and states that the Assembly by ordinance shall adopt and implement from time to time and modify comprehensive plans, setting forth goals, objectives, policies governing the future development of municipality. And we've done that. We've adopted the Chugach River Comprehensive Plan, the 2020 plan, the Ballpark Plan, the Recreational Facility Plan, and the Hillside District Plan. And within 2 of those plans, specifically the Eagle River Comprehensive Plan, it spells out the process to effectuate providing access into Chugach State Park. And the 2020 doesn't have as specific language as the Chugach River Comprehensive Plan does, but it also provides policy direction to implement the plan with the objective of access to Chugach State Park. And there are many methods, and we will discuss this throughout the discussion today. The exaction process is only one of the methods that could be used to provide access in the Chugach State Park. But it's recognized in the subdivision code and in the comprehensive plan as a process that could be used. So staff has analyzed all of your proposed amendments. Ready to discuss or talk about them, offer suggestions to hopefully ameliorate or accomplish whatever you're looking for.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver. Are there any specific questions from Mr. Weaver before I allow Mr. Starr to ask his questions that Charlie has?
Well, I appreciate the fact that you have all the documents here, but most people don't. I even asked them. So I am going to take the liberty to read this because it does go into that. It's not very long. This is in the new code, basically 2108-040 in section D, and it's paraphrased in, I guess, whoever wrote this second one here. The plating authority shall require the dedication of access for trails designated on adopted municipal plans unless an alternative access point within the subdivision is clearly agreed to be preferable for dedication. For pedestrian access, a right-of-way dedication is the preferred method of providing access, but the plating authority may approve a public use easement dedication or an access tract where appropriate. If the plating authority approves an alternate location for a trail access or a substitute for an existing easement or right-of-way, the existing unused easement or right-of-way shall be vacated unless the property owner agrees otherwise. The plating authority may modify the alignment, width, and scope of all trail access routes as necessary to integrate trail subdivision and design. And then basically under the access portion of the Chugach State Park community areas and natural resource areas, which this specifically has verbiage in here, the plating authority shall require the dedication of public pedestrian access for a trail designated on adopted municipal plans for connectivity with a trail or access point to a large use or natural resource area as defined in the Anchorage Park Bowl Plan, the Natural Resource and Recreation Facility Plan, the Chugach Eagle River Comprehensive Plan, and for connectivity with the trail or access point identified in the most current Chugach State Park Access Plan. The plating authority may modify the alignment, width, and scope of the trail access routes as necessary to integrate trail and subdivision design so long as the resulting trails are of comparable gradient, directness, and utility and reflect the general locations and patterns of existing or planned public access routes. Acceptable pedestrian access shall be platted in accordance with relevant provisions of this title and be at least 20 feet wide and centered on an existing recognized new or relocated trail. The plating authority shall require the dedication of a vehicular right-of-way for public access to trails, parks, and other public plans as defined in subsection D1 above that are identified in an adopted municipal plan or Chugach State Park Access Plan. Accepted vehicular right-of-way shall be a public street that is platted and dedicated in accordance with the code. And I went through all this motions because it's clear that it's linked together, and I don't know that it's a surprise, but when light bulbs go off, that if we sweep our arms inside and capture all these dedicated access points that are on the maps, then they sort of have a mark on them. And the mark is going to be when that subdivider, whether he has 5 acres and he's trying to give an acre to his daughter, or he has 50 acres and he's trying to build homes and roads and all that other stuff, I think the process is the same. Mr. Wheeler, if somebody doesn't want to dedicate a right-of-way access, they don't get their subdivision. Is that right?
A couple of things, Mr. Snard. Basically, the new code is not in effect. People can choose to use the new code, but we're working from the existing code. It has a little bit different language. That is very good language that's in the new code, but we still have 2 codes here that we're...
I get it, but December 31st, if we don't delay the implementation of Title 21, the new code's going to take effect. They're going to have to give away a 20-foot dedication for pedestrian and the vehicular start. There's subsections as well that I'm not going to bore you with, but it tells you what the trail has to look like through the subdivision. It tells you the street standards and all of that. So I want to go with the new code because that's where we're headed in December.
So your original question specifically was...
If the plating authority, and it's not always the plating board, in a short plat, you're the plating authority. If you sit down with a plat and you say, I don't want the full, I want a short plat or an abbreviated plat, whoever the plating authority is.
It's structured in the department. We have a plating officer.
Okay.
That's Mr. Whitfield, and Mr. Whitfield is the plating authority and signs all those documents. The reason there's a linkage to the plating process, the subdivision process, whether it's abbreviated plat process or the conventional long plat process, there are procedures to go through with this. Well, there's one, you can argue your case at either the plating board level or with the plating officer on the application of the need necessity for that.
Right.
And for them to make a decision. And as we indicated and we gave you some other documents, there has to be a rational nexus for every dedication exaction that's required.
But the only people that have to go through it are the people that have a red dot on their property.
There's no doubt about it. This started in 2002 with the inventory that Chugach Department of Natural Resources started to develop. They didn't have enough specificity. They ground truth it in 2008 to really look at every one of these access points. they've put in hundreds of hours.
I know how we got here, I'm just saying, what happens if this plan becomes...
Well, what happens-
If, in fact, the question is, if you don't reach mediation with the homeowner that says...
There's an appellate process. There's an appellate process.
The private property owner gets to pay for all this appeal and land use designers and engineers and all that to defend why he doesn't want people marching through his land. Is that...
Well, there's an appellate process if there's an overreach by the municipality.
All right, well, you know, Mr. Chairman, there could be all kinds of education on just what the plan does and doesn't do, but what we've done so far is we've taken the access plan and now equated it into common law that's going to take effect December 31st, or the old code. I'm not here to dispute that, but my challenge is several. Is that Title 21 in its own definitional page doesn't define access point in the definitions of it. So when you say it's a good access point, in other standards of code, or other code prescribing, there's standards that have to be met. It preserves the characteristics of the neighborhood, or it does that. I'm concerned that we're going down a road with a plan that the supporting document isn't ready to help institute fair process. Not to mention that it's expensive and solely falls on the burden of the private property owner, but things like an approved access seems arbitrary. Is there a prescription inside the Title 21 that says these is the litmus test of a prescribed access?
Not perhaps limits, but in the general standards of 2175-010, the current code, the plating, charges the plating authority responsibilities to look and provide for safe and efficient movement of vehicular and traffic and pedestrian circulation. And then it says the plating authority may impose conditions upon the approval of the preliminary final plat that it finds necessary to conform the standards in this section in that particular application. So there's linkages back to the plans, there's linkages back to the comprehensive plan, and if perhaps, say, just as a kind of a generic kind of scenario, that someone applies for a subdivision, they have this annotation on their property that it could provide reasonable access into Chugach State Park. It has to be demonstrated at that point in time that it does, that it really has to be validated that it is, and the exaction will take place.
Isn't the plan that we're about to approve?
Mr. Johnson was next in queue, I apologize.
Well, and it's just a follow-up to one of the issues that Mr. Scott brought up, and I've heard this before as far as within families. If you have a landowner that has 25 acres and wants to subdivide to give a child an acre, and do it in a short plat, wouldn't platting look at that more as a driveway? I mean, isn't that one of the one of the options for that type of situation?
Ms. Johnson, I would agree with that, because there, you have to look at the rational nexus requirement. There's still plenty of land left to develop in the future. We have an immediate need for conveyance of a particular property in a situation that the municipality should give them consideration in that situation.
Another situation, 25 acres, parents want to give it to the two children and they split it in half. You're still large acreage. Again, could that be considered a driveway?
I think what you'd have to consider is there possibility
Access.
that it's not coming back in the future, or will it come back in the future? That's kind of a decision that has to be made at the time based upon topography and the way they're splitting it. And the staff and with the applicant would have to be reasonable in looking at that and coming to a decision. And if they're not reasonable, if the administration or the staff is not reasonable, there's that appellate process for them to go through.
Mr. Starr?
What is that? In a short plat, it's not some long drawn out hearing or there's no public testimony. It's basically a homeowner that, and it could be somebody just wanting to pair off an acre of it, lands up in the subdivisions in Eagle River, sell for $100,000. So a lot of these people are banking on this for retirement. And so the complexities that I'm facing are, does the characteristic of that private preserved land at the end of that road change now because you're going to invite public use to it? the people are concerned, rightly so, that their property value upon subdivision, not just the example of giving it to your children, that's going to be able to bring $100,000 of dedicated acres. So in the short plat abbreviation, which is cheaper, faster, and more one-on-one, if the short plat is unsuccessful, can you describe to me what the appellant process looks like to these?
The planning board is a de novo full public hearing.
How much does that cost under today's numbers?
I can look it up here, I think it's like $350. Take it on the planning board.
We're at $980 for a subdivision basic plat, is that right?
For instance, the abbreviated plat, I haven't looked at the figures recently.
I think it's $1,000, or sort of to start the process. But the appeal process then goes to the full board. Again, back to the standards. Where are the standards saying that this has to occur, there has to be good turnaround for fire trucks, there has to be this, that, and the other thing?
They're in 2175 and 2180. The standards for the subdivision process are located there.
For large residential subdivisions or every acreage?
Residential and commercial.
And that's what the planning board's going to use to determine whether this is a good access point or not.
They'll look at them on a case-by-case basis. For example, when the Henry property, when Henry was trying to develop his property, I believe he was doing a combination subdivision and PUD. The trail user community came out in force to talk about access into the area. We didn't have any refined analysis of what would be appropriate to go into the park. And so that subdivision did not go forward. But I guess my point was, with this document, at least it gives us a starting point to work from. Whether all these thoughts come to fruition or not depends on which access points utilized and which ones are ruled out.
The .75 that you referenced is the overall subdivision compliance. I'm wanting to know specifically, how do you say that this access point works? That it's not in a slide zone or it's not in an area?
That's the staff's responsibility when it goes through the process. They send to about over 20 review agencies, and parks would be part of that. Our own trails coordinator would be part of that. They have to ground truth it. It's just not, they have to ground truth it just like they would if it were a road. Does it meet the grade requirements of the MASS and the DCM? Is this an appropriate trail? Is the grade too excessive? And some of these properties have a lot of topography to them, so there's going to have to be a lot of ground truthing with respect.
Well, I guess my point is the approved criteria that you quote is not specific to access plans. That Eagle River 14 goes through this whole thing, that there's adequate power available, there's trash service, there's roads. It doesn't have that, so we're clear in that there is no descriptive study in here that says this access point will be studied evenly and fairly across this criteria.
But if this plan is adopted, it will be used just like the official streets and highway plan, the parks plan, the trails plan. This actually amends the trails plan to include these areas.
Yeah, I get that, and that's my other point, is you referenced the Eagle River Comprehensive Plan. That's much more driven by a trails plan, that this is where we want the trails to go. And I'll close because it's opinionated, is that if in fact we were dealing with an expanded trails plan to discuss that, the access points would, to me, blend. And I'm still waiting for the overlay of the trails plans approved onto the access points, because what I find is there's access points that we're selecting that I believe, in my opinion, in our area, the trail will never go to it. And so the idea that we're going to preserve a subdivided right with never coming back to revisit the trails conversation, which the comp plan says in my district says it's a trails-driven plan and not an access plan. I guess if I had the luxury of being able to say, well, would that Southport plan ever entice that access point? I don't think that we're having that conversation. We're looking at access points and then we're going to draw lines to them. A little bit different than what I think.
Get that data for you. I think that could be overlaying on the existing trails plan.
Well, the last logic point is then how do I answer up to the conversation, or Ptarmigan, for example, is a dedicated access point, parking is already there. what's the litmus test that says the acre a quarter mile away from Ptarmigan Valley, which is right off the Glen Highway, is not adequate to serve the area for the future? Why preserve the rights for a quarter acre a half a block away?
Dave and Monica can really speak to those issues because they're the ones that have looked at this in detail with respect to the locations and the separation and.
Well, again, Mr. Chairman, I'm not certain that I want to go through ER 14. It's going to be vastly boring to anybody other than Amy and myself on what ER 14's benefits are. So I'm appreciative that you've rejected every one of them, but I have more. I will pass this out because Ms. Tucker, who's not here, and I have been working on an opportunity to perhaps prescribe that those points that are not secured have a definite difference in definition than our unsecured points. And so my point on this is that I think there's a distinct difference between points that have gone through the whole, and stay with me on this because the plan speaks to two of these. A secured point seems to have gotten its way into the plan because a process occurred. What we're asked to do now is take the red dots and sweep them in and knowing full well that they're unsecured. And so I think the definition between secured and unsecured to me is relevant from that. I have no problem with the public process kicking in for a secured point. I really don't. In fact, I'm happy that some of the points are secured in that. If the trend is to move towards a secured point, my biggest angst with the whole thing is we're using Title 21 as the hammer to do so. We're not having a fair conversation that would allow the guy that's at the end of that cul-de-sac to raise his hand and say, hey, why don't you buy me out, and that'll solve your access problem into Ram Valley. We don't seem to foster that through this plan. Is Julia somewhat correct in the distinction between secured and unsecured language? They really are two different levels.
Does she write commentary on that?
Mr. Starr, we're giving you a fair amount of leeway here.
You have, Mr. Chairman, but I walk into 15 of my amendments. If there's something else on the topic that you want to talk about, then let's talk about it.
There is.
I just laid a bunch of proposed amendments on here that may take 1 through 15 away.
I appreciate that.
It's a public disclosure of information.
Okay. And Mr. Weaver has not had a chance to review that, so it's
Right.
a little bit unfair to ask him to answer that directly at the moment. If you would indulge me, I would like to ask him to speak to the memorandum that we received a couple of days ago via the clerk's office.
Fair enough. Yesterday, I think it was, wasn't it?
I don't recall precisely. I have a lot of stuff on my calendar too. So, Mr. Weaver, if you would be kind enough, the October 3rd memorandum speaking to current regulations and new language recommendation. Could you speak to that or assign one of your staff to do so?
We probably can go through that in the best.
Thank you. This was in response, started with the response to Mr. Hall's statements at the hearing, at the end of the hearing, was that last week? His concern about red dots, trying to address your concerns, the state of the red dots, et cetera. So we thought we would give you some explanatory language, try to weave a story for you that led to what we considered some new language to add to the plan as an amendment at the bottom of page 2, top of page 3, addressing the red dots, fairly black and white, as we thought. That was a good addition to address what we heard. We also added a breakdown for the Eagle River area, since those are the amendments we were anticipating, to give some perspective on distribution of red dots versus the service areas, and therefore the conclusion and the significance of the red dots in including it to Eagle River. And that's mostly on page 3. And we reiterated language that the Planning and Zoning Commission had put in, which we thought was relevant to the discussion about the red dots in the middle of page 2 there. It's labeled number 8. And again, we tried to tie in discussion about the relationship between the comprehensive plan and how it's implemented via this type of document.
And Mr. Ovish, you asked the municipal attorney's office to prepare an amendment that would incorporate the language you have at the bottom of page 2 and top of page 3 at this point, or
No, we have not.
would you like for that to happen?
I would sponsor that.
We could do it either way. We thought maybe if the assembly approved of it, that they would introduce it.
I kind of lead towards it in my second amendment here as well, so cooperatively if we can do that. I'm trying to make salvage of the plan as opposed to chucking the whole thing out doing that. So in the liberty of a work session, because it's lesser tone, the point I friction on yours is that it's still back to the same problem. The property owner who's now designated has to initiate the plan. It's very punitive on the property owner to get out from underneath the red dot. If he doesn't, he's got to defend it, he's got to talk about it every turn, he's got to tell the person when he sells his lot that it's part of a plat note somewhere. I find that to be punitive. So your latitude in your thing without turning it into an amendment, all bottom line boils back down to the fact that if he applies at the planning office for a subdivide of 5 acres and wants to peel off, there's no relief. He's got to do it. And that's the point, is that I would want another conversation in an ideal world that moved a red dot to a blue one at the nexus, if you use your word, at the nexus in the energy of somebody other than the property owner. And meaning that red dots would turn into blue dots and then be added to the plan. That would be far more palatable to the property owners that are now earmarked with that, is that the blue dots are fine. I'm happy that they've occurred that way, but the red dots, now that become part of that turn into a burdensome platting process later, are really the basis of it. And 1 through 15 was an attempt to take them all out. But I would need to do 30, 40, 50 of them because I've got over 60 in my area.
I think what I heard at some point in there, Mr. Wheeler, was that if you would kindly have your staff prepare that amendment, Mr. Johnston would like to have it.
Well, what I also said was amendment number 2
I understand.
has it listed, and Mr. Tucker's helping me with that one. So rather than be redundant, I would email it out to those folks and let them study it. It's pretty easily written.
Appreciate that. Okay. What I think I'm hearing from you, Mr. Starr, is you don't necessarily desire to walk through the amendments you previously submitted. Are there other questions from assembly members for staff while we're here? Mr. Honeman?
You're talking about I'm losing place just a tad. Are you talking about on the proposed amendments that we were here to discuss, or are you talking about on the new documents?
About the proposed amendments that we had previously here to discuss, it's tough to just dig into the ones we just received, given that nobody besides us have even seen them, and I haven't had a chance to read them myself. Okay.
Well, and the only thing is that there are a couple of responses back from the analysis to at least one or two in particular in Basher's Duncan Heights area.
Do you wish to ask a question about that?
Sure. And so, looking at, and I appreciate the language in, bear with me, and the new regulations requirement on number 8, and what we just discussed, meaning that the language would clarify to the P&Z that these red dots are conceptual in design. Now, I speak for quite a few of our constituents who are very concerned about the difference between H2A and H3. And H3, ironically, where a lot of us are saying, why doesn't the state park carve out some of its own property and create access and lots and such? So H3 is one of those areas so it seems a bit hypocritical, if you will, at least convoluting what I had said earlier and what I've been hearing. And that is H3 has been secured. It is part of the park area, so I can appreciate that. It is already an unofficial pedestrian walkway into the park, or at least into portions of the park. The concern is, as much as what's been discussed, I think Mr. Starr's constituents have spelled it out and came out very vocally at the last assembly meeting, and that is, there are several people in that community, including the community council, who have recommended other than H3 and given some fairly good concepts, much as the language says it's a concept. And I see back here that again, the department, I'm guessing it's planning department, that is saying, doesn't concur with this result, doesn't concur with this. And so once again, and I've just got to speak on my constituents' behalf, what their concerns are in an overall sense, and specifically to H3 and H2A, is that no one seems to be taking their conceptual ideas and thoughts seriously. And so to say that the lot that's being recommended to a larger lot versus a medium-sized lot, and I'm glad to see that you at least recommended that, would be conceptually a medium lot versus a large lot in that one particular area. The issue for me is that you're willing to spend a ton of money to try to get up an area that, for geological purposes, I mean, water and the way the road is confined and the limited road service area is going to be, the hydrology on that is going to be a challenge in the big time. You're talking millions of dollars just to get a road cut up, a dirt road for access, not to mention the improvements that you might have to make with the caretakers and such. So my concerns are the H2A being, and there was a concept design, and I think you guys have it, I forgot to bring it with me today, but there's a concept that is platted for about 7 to 8 spots that, yes, you would have to dig into the side of the mountain, but it'd be a whole heck of a lot cheaper than going into H3 a road. And then add to that some of the recommendations to put a large lot a little farther down the hill where there's an already existing pullout, which is really not designed for parking. There isn't, it's a turnaround and there are people parked there, but it hasn't been improved, and there's plenty of room to do it. And you guys have even stated, yeah, we can probably make it a medium lot, but it's probably not suitable for money-wise. It'd be a challenge to make it a large lot. No different than trying to cut a road up into H3 and create a parking lot there. So my guess, my question to you is, in the form of a question, saying that is, as Mr. Starr said, there isn't any, on these conceptual plan, there isn't anything that marries up with what is DNR's priorities, where are they going to seek the funding, and I recognize that you have to have a plan so you can go somewhere to say, hey, here's our plan, can we get the funding to do X, Y, and Z? Where's the priorities here? Why can't, if we're going to review this and reassess this plan, why can't we put our funding and our priority and energy in some of these proposed concepts from within the community that's acceptable? They're not saying we don't want access. They're saying, hey, these are the better plans. These are conceptually better. And they've done a fair amount of investment of their own monies and time to try to get these things studied. And it seems that, that once again, government isn't listening.
I think Mr. Weaver would like to try and respond to
Okay.
what I think he thinks
So I
the question
apologize.
was.
Monica and he have looked at these three, and they can have discussion with you and maybe bring you up to date in respect to those three locations, because things have changed a little bit since they were originally put on the docket.
You mean since it was introduced to the assembly, or since?
No.
Why don't you go through
So in the course of this plan being developed, the state was able to acquire the property that H3 is on. And the concept that you're discussing was presented by DNR to the community as a possibility for one day when we do have funding to provide parking in the area. All H3 is doing is holding that as a placeholder, because it also went through an analysis with our engineers, and it showed that that was actually also a good place for parking. And so it's there as a placeholder. When we go to develop parking in that area, we've committed to work through a public process with the community, again, to determine which site and what it would look like and what's most appropriate, and that's the language that's contained in the plan. So there's no kind of hard and fast decisions being made there. It's just a placeholder because it did go through the modeling exercise, and H3 did come out of that as fitting the criteria for good parking. It doesn't mean that that's where it's going to end up. It's just that that's kind of the science behind why that came out for H3. H2A is still a possibility as well. It's just less than ideal because it is right between two neighbors' driveways, and so that's counter to the concept of trying to push things into the park and lessen the impact on neighbors. The truth is, we don't know. There's not funding at the time to develop that parking lot yet, and when there is, we've committed to come back and work with the community to determine what's the best.
So that's getting me to where I was trying to get at. Just to follow, Mr. Chairman, bear with me, I'll make sure. So the funding for, if in fact you were able to get funding, what would then be the priority? H3 over the other kind of conceptual, community-driven suggestions to to the modifications to the plan, or forget all those and go straight to H3?
No, I think we would work with the community. If we've got funding, we'd work to determine which area, if we got funding to put some parking up in that area, it's at that time that we would determine where it would be appropriate through a public process.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I understand what you're saying, and but I think the neighbors, and Paul and I have actually been up there and walked the area. There is a trailhead called Basher Trailhead that's listed as H6 on the map. And that currently could possibly park 10 cars if it weren't for the gigantic mud holes that were there right now. And the neighbors think that that area would be easier, more easily expanded. And the road up to that point in New Stucking Heights is much better. The road narrows and gets more steep as you get past that point. And also the fact that it's right by the road makes it more easily seen by people that live in the neighborhood driving by. Whereas H3 would be at the end of the road with very little supervision, and they're really worried that could turn into Party Central. So I think maybe if we were able to develop the medium-sized parking lot at H6, the need to develop H3 might never happen.
And I agree with you. We provide language in the plan as well to say that enlarging that lot to as large as feasible is most ideal to try to capture the use before it enters in the neighborhood. So that's also language that's going to be contained in the plan, precisely for that reason.
Ms. Johnston?
Would it be appropriate to say that Mr. Hahnemann and Mr. Peterson would be fantastic spokespeople for the community when there's an approach to go to get capital appropriation for a trailhead up in Stuckagen, that they could actually be the carrier of this message on how that is done for the community, but that's the point where they would be doing it, not in this access plan?
I would concur with that the access plan is just about securing the possibility to be able to do something in the future.
But when it actually comes to the development of a trailhead, that's a capital appropriation process that the state parks, the legislature goes through. And so that would be at that point that the community works with their legislators and works on how that appropriation is done. Is that correct?
Mr. Stark?
A great segue to bring into Wallace Ranch, because we've done that. Every one of my community councils has taken on twice now recommendations, unanimous recommendations to purchase the Wallace Ranch homestead, which is 320 acres, abuts the park, and yet it's just not correct inside the plan. So it's either outdated because that's the case, from one side to another. Currently, there appears to be very little use of the site. You walk across Wallace Ranch when you take the backside of the Mount Baldy Trail down. Mr. Tucker's been issuing pens. There's probably 100 people a day that use the backside of Wallace Ranch. So the plan, if we adopt it this Tuesday, it's wrong. And Ms. Johnston is correct. We lobbied the legislature to access based on the viability of all the community council inputs, and it went nowhere. Granted, we were looking for a lot of money, but back to the strategy of trying to salvage the plan is that if we just picked 5 of these parts and said this is what we wanted to focus our intentions on, the community would be better served. We'd be able to prioritize our funding requests through our CIPs as opposed to that. If I only had your issue of one access point concern, that's an easy one to fix. I've got 7, Thunderbird, Ptarmigan, Ram Valley, Upper Eagle River Valley. This is why I need a little bit more time at the work sessions, Mr. Chairman. Half of the plan affects Ms. Dombowski's in my area, literally half of the plan. We're not trying to be selfish. We just have a lot on the plate here. It's changing neighborhoods. And we can't let that happen. So how do you suggest, based on you disagree with my amendment for Eagle River 7 priority, how do you handle that conversation where every community council in our district says buy the Wallace Ranch and make it an access?
Could I ask Mr. Starr a question on that?
Yeah.
Did you work with Great Land Trust on that?
Not the second go-around. The first go-around, I just stuck it in the CIP, which was,
Because that's how we dealt with one up on the hillside.
Yeah.
It's Great Land Trust, and that is a fire, and that's actually how they got.
yeah, well, you actually voted to put it in the CIP as well, 2
Yeah,
legislative
no,
cycles ago.
I'm just saying that might be the place.
It might be, and Brand wants your help for that if it's got momentum. But again, the illustration is what you suggested was be the spokesman. We did that. Every assembly member on the body voted to put it in the CIP, and yet you don't have it as part of your priority in your plan.
We discussed that yesterday, Mr. Starr. Monica can speak to it. I think the conclusion of that discussion yesterday was that Baldy actually served as adequate access into that area as a prioritizing. It's not that.
If you're built like you go, then you go straight up. You know, the Wallace Ranch has a flat
Bill's
field.
property is a great property. And technically, Deed and Monica can speak to, my understanding was that it didn't provide a lot of access into the park.
All I'm going to say is, how do I amend it? Mr. Tucker's willing to sell it. It's not even the red dotted plan that has a priority. So back to Mr. Holman's point is, how do we move them to community priorities? You know, there's 50 years worth of access points here. If I just had 5 years, I could make a difference. Until then, I'm just going to have to chuck it. I don't know the answer.
Mr. Starr, it is a red dot in the plan, ER7.
I would say additionally, the Parks Management Plan makes recommendations for acquisition of the property funds allow.
In any sort of priority?
It's in the acquisition section, you know, those, we could prioritize it. Often the legislature doesn't pay attention to the priorities we provide.
Do you think?
Mr. Holman.
Okay.
Just to that point, Ms. Johnson is correct, and we have several members from our community here. Several members of the community actually lobbied to secure the site known as H3 through, I think it was Great Land Trust. It was some funding that was secured, and that parcel, and so there's no objection to access to H3. It's the parking area that's the problem, because it's at the end of a very narrow LURSA, the winding drainage issues, and obviously everything that comes along with at the end of a road, not very well monitored, not, you know, there's the security, there's the trash, there's the party haven, the, you know, just the volume on a very, and like I say, we're very fortunate. We already have a lot of access points on, as you know, and concentrated in an area. But, and the community really wants, doesn't object to access, it's, they like to have their voice heard. And there's resolutions on record.
I don't have anybody else in queue. Ms. Johnson?
I just had a question. I think Mr. Peterson had, and I'm sorry, I ran out the door without my packet. Did you have an amendment as far as to look at acquisition of military property once it became available? And I
Your
don't.
amendments are 18, 19, and 20, and they're in the stack. So there's the last 3 amendments in the stack that everybody has.
All right.
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
And so that was.
so this will be number 19. For some reason we have that, mentioned Shift Creek in there. Actually, it's probably,
Yeah.
Chester Creek actually might be correct. But, see, most of East Anchorage and Muldoon is only a couple of miles from, or less than, in many areas, less than a mile from the park, but we have no access points, and we have to drive to Sucking Heights or Eagle River or South Anchorage to access the park. And no one knows exactly what's going to happen with the military reservation in the future. Since this is a forward-looking document, I thought, you know, at some point in time in the future, if the base was unfortunately closed or reduced, that might be a great area for people in East Anchorage to get access to the park. And the Alaska Greenhouse property borders right on the military reservation, and the back 12 acres is already designated as parkland. And so if we could use that as an access point some point in the future, that way people in Muldoon and East Anchorage wouldn't have to drive farther to get access to the park.
And in your comments, it looks like you felt that the military would not support this change. And I just thought it was sort of a global amendment that, I thought it was harmless. It was just,
Yeah, but
Commissioner Tosh.
it is a great idea, but it also opens the wound that we've had for 3 years now with the military, that we've reopened it with the East District plan as far as access on the military property. They really don't want that door open. So we were just speaking in our experience, how they would probably respond to that.
I can perhaps, I'm sure Mr. McGillis can speak to this too, but I'll offer you a little bit of benefit of my private sector career. The level of Ursine activity on post this summer was such that the MPs were restricted to the Cantonment area, which is where people live and work, to the point where they couldn't clear the range of trespassers, people camping, hiking, etc., and therefore the range was closed. You might imagine that the person in charge of operating it was somewhat upset by this. I think what Mr. Tovish is speaking to is along the lines of that concern. Mr. Vickios, you are, as former garrison commander, you may have some insight on that.
Well, insight on that, and also a meeting that I attended, I was asked by the military to come to a meeting, I think it was about 3 weeks ago now, and it has to do with encroachment issues, and that's what their concern is. Any time they have an encroachment issue that prevents them from conducting their mission, it puts them in jeopardy when it comes to looking at bases to be closed. We're very fortunate up here, for the most part, that most of our bases don't have real-time encroachment issues like they do in the Lower 48. So what was expressed to me at that meeting was, and they did bring up the Northeast Anchorage Plan as an example. They also brought up numerous other examples to include that example, which has happened several times. So that is purely a encroachment issue. And again, if it gets too bad, and when they start looking at bases, and the base can make a case, or any other person can make a case, that they're not able to, or they're prohibited from conducting the mission as outlined, then that does put that base in jeopardy. It clearly does. And so that's why they're very concerned about the Northeast Anchorage Plan and all these other type of issues. So, and it's right to be concerned from their point of view because of that. Because if you look historically around the nation, an awful lot of these bases that's been closed is because the conflict between growth of the community and infringement onto the bases, and they just haven't been able to solve the problem. So.
thank you for the clarification.
Mr. Stark.
I had asked Ms. Tucker to review some of the new Title 21 language, but in the course of the conversation, I asked Mr. Wheeler to review the concept of why wouldn't we have everybody that abuts the park be subject to in the punitive nature that I think it is. Why wouldn't you include everybody in the conversation upon subdivision as opposed to that? And Mr. Wheeler, I read your answer a little bit, but you infer that the plan sort of, and I don't want to speak for you, but your answer was sort of that the plan does that. Also, could you define what traditional use was in your mind? I made a sarcastic remark that it was Pete Pannery's walking my community saying, this is a great place to access the park. I did it in the 50s. So your answer to me, first off, I didn't circulate it, but could we? And then the second thing is, can you elaborate on traditional use as well as why wouldn't we incorporate everybody in that abuts the state park?
Yeah, I can circulate the answers. With respect to identifying parcels, that's the whole point of planning, is you go through a process of identifying parcels that may be in a range of suitability, that you filter out those that are not going to be usable under any scenario, and those that are highly desirable for whatever attributes they may have. That's the whole point of developing a plan. If you want to use a plan, it's got to be something that's meaningful. if you simply had a map that identified every adjacent parcel, that's not a plan. And if you tried to use that, I think you'd run into a lot of problems trying to defend that as a well-documented, rational analysis of what properties are available for access.
You
So
didn't answer the
you have to go through that
discriminatory
process.
question I had, though, is when you do that, what I asked you was, is it discriminatory to pick that one but not the one that's adjacent to it next door, even though the characteristics and the attributes might be the same? We've just said inside the plan.
The
this
key
case.
is whether they're the same.
I
And
see.
so if you go through the process of developing criteria and you apply the criteria, and one parcel is ranked higher than another because of the criteria, there's nothing discriminatory about that process. There's nothing irrational or arbitrary about that process.
You know, if you could more cue, Mr. Shardy, mind if I move on a little bit?
No, I wanted to hear that traditional use has been used a lot in terms of traditional access or traditional use.
Right.
And you talk about these standards of selection, and traditional use seems to be one that,
That wasn't a question you'd asked me before, so
I
I
thought it
haven't.
was maybe,
No, I haven't thought about traditional use, how it's identified or
maybe someone else
described.
can
in
answer
the
the question. What is the definition of traditional use?
Use that's been happening over time.
The public
Yeah.
participated a lot in defining that also in the process. Trails.
Could I follow up on this? Because I think historically, there was a look at these access points to be every half mile, or you were trying to add that.
Quarter.
Quarter, yes. And that raised a lot of issues. And so they went more where there was traditional use, where there was a trail that was being used. Is that correct?
I would say 90% of the information contained in the plan, the dots, much of that information came to us because people have already been traditionally accessing the park that way. And then we coupled that information with a lot of analysis on wetlands and terrain and those kind of data. But people often brought us that information because that's where they had customarily accessed the park, speaking to the convenience aspect of.
But there was a look at, because it would seem fair that you just go across the whole boundary.
And what I'm hearing in the field when I visit these points is, well, yeah, that was true 10 years ago, but since this happened, you know, Ptarmigan opened up or they expanded Baldy, no one does it anymore. So I guess that's what I'm hearing in the field, is that you're right in some of those areas. And then the other one is just the guys that have bought the land in the last 5 years put up no trespassing signs, which is part of why we're here, is all of that. So, you know, traditional doesn't make it right, I guess, is what I infer.
Mr. Owen?
So to that point, and fits right in with the conversation, apparently there was a former garrison commander from Fort Ridge who lived in the community of Basher, Second Heights, and through whatever process, the pullout closer to the near point, there's a large pipe-looking item, it looks like it serves the purpose of a fence with some no trespassing, that was moved farther in towards the military property to allow kind of a pullout and some access that had been traditional use. So I know that the military partners are willing to work. In fact, the discussion at that point to some of the neighbors' accounts historically was that as long as it didn't encroach, if you say further, then you know they were willing to set and negotiate and at least have their part of the stakeholder, because they recognize that they also affront a lot in our area of town. But I just want to remind everybody that we had a couple of people testify. I can recall the one young man that says, doesn't matter what the sign says, he's going to go across property no matter what. So as to the encroachment, I think that's what goes back to the neighborhood's concerns about enforcement, making sure there's lights and bear-proof trash cans, and perhaps a little more enforcement on the properties and access points as they already exist with some improvements.
Mr. Michaelis, you want to tell the story of how the Alaska Native Heritage Center came to be built and how that land was acquired? Or do you want to leave that to a later date?
Probably I'd have to refresh my memory on that one, but
Okay, and I'll tell Mr. Holloman later.
Yeah.
Ms. Domboski, you were going to
No, thank
and you've been very patient. Thank you.
Yeah. I just want to point out, you know, when we talk about traditional use, I not just about the person who may have bought the property for 10 years, but I know a homesteader in Eagle River who has 300 acres who has traditionally had no trespassing signs up and had people not come to his property because they've soiled it, they've loitered on it, they've littered on it. So when we're saying traditional use, it may be traditionally trespass. And it doesn't mean that it's somebody who's just been there for a short amount of time. You have families that have been there for 40 years that maybe don't want people trouncing across their property because they've had vandalism and theft. So I just want to point that out. But my question was really about the discussion about the military land. So, Mr. Weaver, is there any complications with the fact that these lands may be involved with NALA? So if they no longer, I mean, how does that intersect?
So NALA doesn't cover all military property, but to the extent that it does cover military property, it basically lays out if it's surplus or excess to military needs, there's an arrangement for the municipality to take ownership along with Eklutna and work out how they're going to divide up those interests. Again, that's not something anybody's asking for or wishing for at this time, but if and when that were to ever happen, that would be the first document we would look to. If they're NALA lands, we have to follow that process. It contemplates that there could be major subdivisions, there would be major planning documents that would have to come into play in terms of how that property is going to be utilized. There's requirements for us to share and allocate resources with Eklutna. But if it's not covered by NALA and it's surplus, and the military, the feds go through this process about how they're going to surplus this and who it's going to go to. And again, if any of it comes to the municipality or is going to go into private hands, you'd have to develop plans for how to deal with that property, and access issues would be dealt with at that point.
So I guess, what piqued my curiosity is the fact that we're even starting to discuss military lands. And I just want to make sure that, because this is a unique document, essentially, that I want to make, not just this, but now this unique document, I want to make sure that we're not complicating things with that first obligation. Does that make sense?
I think the way I would look at this is similar to what Mr. Michaelis was saying, and that is, anytime you start talking about military lands in your planning documents, the concern is it emboldens people to do things that they're not authorized to do. I mean, this plan could reference that someday, if military land was excess, it should be looked at for access. But if you put it in the plan, even though it's worded that way and it's that vague, people do get concerned, and other people may decide, oh, the plan said something about military land, it must be okay. So there's this concern about what's the message. The message may be best left alone at this point, because we don't know if and when it's ever going to happen. But as a legal matter, there's no legal prohibition from simply mentioning it as a possibility somewhere down the road. It's really a question of perception and messaging.
Ms. Johnston next, but I'm not sure if you already got your point in. No? Okay. I don't have anybody else in the queue. Mr. Peterson? We're getting close to our witching hour here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as far as the military land is concerned, there's a trail that has been worn, it's been there for years, and it goes right by a sign that says, no trespassing, unexploded ordinance. And so,
We own that project.
People feel like there's a trail there, they want to hike it, they want to walk their dog there, or whatever. How do you stop them? I mean, it's not realistic to think that we can. And I know that the military likes to use the area just east of where I live, to practice dropping ordnance and shooting weapons and that type of thing. And the people still wear the trail out there and go out there and cross-country skiing at any time.
And that's a concern.
So it's turned into a traditional use area.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I don't have anybody else in the queue. I think we have beaten this as much to death as we can today. So with that,
I tried not to beat anything, Mr. Chairman. I tried to be thorough, so I take a little bit of offense to that.
noted. With that, we'll be adjourned.